My parents handed my older brother a $100,000 check to buy his dream home and told me to just rent somewhere. So I did. I used my savings to buy my first property, and then I kept buying more. Years later, when my brother begged me to co-sign the lease on a luxury townhome because he was facing foreclosure, I slid my corporate portfolio across the table and smiled. When he asked what it was, I told him I was his new landlord, and his application was denied. Before I get to that satisfying moment, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Madeline, and I'm 28 years old. Or rather, I was turning 28 on the exact night my entire understanding of my family shattered. It was a brisk Friday evening in October, and we were gathered at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Chicago. The restaurant was the kind of place my parents loved to show off in. Heavy oak paneling, dim amber lighting, and waiters wearing crisp white aprons who swept away your crumbs between courses. I had suggested the place months ago, thinking it would be the perfect venue to celebrate a dual milestone. Not only was it my golden birthday, but I had also just received a major promotion to senior supply chain analyst at my firm. I had worked 80-hour weeks for 3 years to earn that title. I sacrificed my weekends, missed out on vacations, and poured every ounce of my energy into proving I was worthy of recognition. I sat at the long table, smoothing the fabric of the dark green dress I had bought specifically for the occasion. I was nervously sipping my sparkling water, waiting for the moment my parents would finally acknowledge my hard work. Across from me sat my older brother, Connor. He was 30 years old and the undisputed golden child of our family. Connor had always been loud, charismatic, and effortlessly magnetic. People naturally gravitated toward him, especially our parents, Richard and Patricia. Growing up, Connor could do no wrong, even when he constantly did. While I was meticulously managing my small allowance and studying for exams, Connor was racking up credit card debt that our parents quietly paid off. Beside him sat his wife, Vanessa. She was wearing a designer silk blouse and flashing her diamond engagement ring every time she reached for her wine glass. They had been married for 2 years, and to my parents, they were the absolute pinnacle of success simply because they looked the part. Connor worked a sales job that barely covered his car lease, but my father spoke about him as if he were running a fortune company. The waiter arrived, placing massive plates of dry-aged ribeye and roasted asparagus in front of us. The smell of expensive food filled the air, and a low hum of chatter buzzed around the table. My aunts and uncles were there too, laughing at one of Connor's exaggerated stories about a golf trip. I smiled politely, cutting into my steak, my heart fluttering with anticipation. My mother Patricia caught my eye from across the table. I sat up a little straighter, waiting for her to say happy birthday. Instead, she frowned slightly, gesturing to my plate. "Make sure you do not eat too much of those potatoes, Madeline," she said, her voice carrying over the conversation. "You sit at a desk all day. You have to watch your figure if you ever want to find a husband. Connor is already married, so we do not have to worry about him. But you are not getting any younger." The familiar sting of her criticism burned my throat, but I swallowed it down with a sip of water. I reminded myself that tonight was supposed to be a celebration. I looked toward my father Richard. He was finishing his glass of red wine, wiping his mouth with a cloth napkin. I knew he was proud of my promotion. He had to be. I was making more money than Connor now, and I had done it completely on my own. I had not asked them for a single dime since I graduated from the state university I paid for myself. Suddenly, my father cleared his throat loudly. He tapped his knife against the side of his crystal wine glass. The sharp clinking sound immediately silenced the table. My aunts and uncles stopped talking. Connor paused mid-sentence. Vanessa put down her fork. I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it. He was going to make a toast. I folded my hands in my lap, preparing to look humble and grateful. "Thank you all for coming tonight," my father began, his voice booming. "It means the world to Patricia and me to have our entire family gathered here at one of our favorite restaurants. Family is the most important thing we have. It is the foundation of our legacy." I smiled, looking around the table. My aunt smiled back at me. "As you all know," my father continued, his chest puffing out with pride, "tonight is a very special night. We are here to celebrate a massive milestone, something that marks the beginning of a beautiful new chapter for our family." My heart swelled. I looked down at my lap, preparing to say thank you. I had even rehearsed a small speech in my head about how my promotion was just the beginning of my career journey. My father reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. "Therefore, Patricia and I wanted to do something extraordinary. Connor, Vanessa, please stand up." My breath caught in my throat. I looked up, confused. Connor and Vanessa exchanged a look of surprise and stood up from their chairs. My father pulled out a large, folded piece of thick cardstock. With a dramatic flourish, he unfolded it and held it up for the entire table to see. It was a novelty-sized bank check, the kind they use for lottery winners or charity donations. Printed in bold black letters across the top was my father and mother's names, and written in the amount box was $100,000. The payee line clearly read, "Connor and Vanessa." "For my beautiful son and my wonderful daughter-in-law," my father announced, his voice thick with emotion. $100,000 to use as a down payment for your dream forever home. Patricia and I could not be more proud of the man you have become, Connor. You are building a real life, a real family, and we want to make sure you have the perfect foundation to grow. The entire table erupted into applause. My aunts and uncles cheered loudly. Vanessa covered her mouth with her hands, letting out a theatrical gasp before throwing her arms around Connor's neck. Connor grinned, looking incredibly smug, as he reached across the table to shake my father's hand and kiss my mother's cheek. "We are so surprised," Vanessa squealed, even though I knew for a fact they had been begging for money for months. "Thank you so much. This is literally the best night ever." I sat there, completely frozen. The sound of the applause felt like physical blows to my chest. I stared at the giant check, the bold numbers blurring together as tears threatened to spill from my eyes. $100,000. My parents had just handed my brother $100,000. No one had said happy birthday to me. No one had mentioned my promotion. I was sitting at my own birthday dinner, a dinner I had organized, watching my family celebrate my brother for absolutely nothing while they completely ignored my existence. The sheer humiliation of the moment paralyzed me. I could not move. I could not speak. I just stared at the empty space on the white tablecloth in front of me, listening to the people who were supposed to love me shower praise on the son who had drained all their resources for years. The applause finally died down, replaced by the clinking of silverware and excited chatter. Connor was holding the massive novelty check like a trophy, grinning while Vanessa wiped fake tears from her eyes. My father signaled the waiter to bring out the champagne. I sat, frozen, feeling a cold numbness spread from my chest to my fingertips. $100,000. The number echoed in my mind. I looked at my mother, who was beaming at Connor with adoration. I took a slow, deep breath to steady my heart rate. I needed to understand what happening. "Dad?" I said, my voice cutting through the noise. My father looked over at me, a slightly annoyed expression crossing his face. I looked from him to the giant check and then back. "What about the college and home fund? The one you and Mom set up for us when we were kids? You always told us that whatever was left in the joint account after graduation would be split equally between us, to help us get started. Since I paid my own tuition and Connor went private, there should be plenty left. Is this check from that fund? The table went completely silent. My aunts and uncles suddenly found their water glasses absolutely fascinating. Connor rolled his eyes, letting out a loud sigh as he leaned back in his leather chair. Vanessa stopped smiling, clutching the giant check a little tighter. My father shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing. He opened his mouth to speak, but my mother beat him to it. Patricia let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that echoed in the quiet dining room. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and irritation, shaking her head. "Oh, Madeline, do not be so dramatic," my mother said, waving her hand. "That fund was drained years ago. Connor needed help with his credit cards after graduation, and we had to assist him with his car payments. He has had a lot of expenses trying to establish himself." I stared at her, the reality of her words hitting me like a physical blow. They had used the money that was supposed to be split between us to bail Connor out of the massive debt he accumulated from buying designer clothes and taking luxury vacations. Before I could process the magnitude of that betrayal, my mother continued, her tone dripping with condescension. "Besides, Connor is starting a real family, Madeline. You are single and focused on your little spreadsheets. You do not need a house. Just rent somewhere." Her words hung in the air. Just rent somewhere. It was the complete dismissal of my life, my career, and my worth. My recent promotion to senior supply chain analyst, the 80-hour work weeks, all of it was reduced to little spreadsheets. I was not a real family because I did not have a husband. I was not worthy of a home. The injustice of it all was staggering. I had spent 4 years working 2 jobs to pay for my tuition at a state school so I would not drain that joint family account. I had driven a beat-up sedan while Connor leased luxury sports cars he could not afford. Whenever the collection agencies called him, my parents would swoop in, writing checks and making excuses. He was the golden boy, and they were his endless safety net. Meanwhile, my independence was rewarded with absolute disregard. They viewed my ability to take care of myself as an excuse to ignore me. "You used my half of the savings to pay off his credit cards, and now you are giving him $100,000 for a house on my birthday?" I said quietly. My father slammed his hand down on the table, making the silverware rattle. "That is enough, Madeline," he snapped, his voice sharp. "We will not have you ruining your brother's special night with your jealousy. We are your parents, and it is our money to distribute as we see fit. Connor needs this more than you do. You have a good salary. Do not be selfish." Selfish. The word echoed in my mind. I looked at Connor. He was sitting there with a smug smirk on his face, unbothered by the fact that he was stealing his sister's future. He leaned over and whispered something to Vanessa, and she giggled, covering her mouth. They felt entitled to my parents' money, and they felt entitled to my silence. I realized then that no amount of arguing, no amount of logic, and no amount of tears would ever make them see the truth. Connor was the star, and my only purpose was to stay out of the way. A normal person might have started screaming. A more emotional daughter might have burst into tears and begged for her parents to love her equally. But as I sat there looking at the people who shared my blood, I did not feel the urge to cry. I felt a cold, calculating clarity wash over me. The desperation for their approval, a burden I had carried for 28 years, simply evaporated. I just needed to leave. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. Catching the eye of the waiter hovering nearby with champagne, I signaled him over. "Excuse me," I said, pulling my sleek black credit card from my clutch. "Can you please charge me for my steak, my sparkling water, and 1 slice of chocolate cake? The rest of the bill belongs to my father." The waiter nodded quickly, taking my card. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls in a dramatic display of offense. "Madeline, What on earth are you doing? Sit down right now. You are causing a scene. I am going home, Mom, I said smoothly, picking up my purse. I am going to go rent somewhere, just like you suggested. Enjoy your champagne. Connor scoffed loudly. Come on, Maddie. Stop acting like a spoiled brat just because you are not the center of attention for 5 minutes. I looked at my brother and felt nothing but pity for the fragile, dependent man he actually was. I did not say another word. The waiter returned with my receipt. I signed it, left a tip, and turned my back on my family. I walked out of the restaurant with my head held high. The crisp autumn air hit my face, refreshing and sharp. I walked 2 blocks to the parking garage where I had left my car. My mind was racing with strategy. My mother had told me to focus on my little spreadsheets. She had told me I did not need a house. She had told me to just rent somewhere. As I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled the phone out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Connor. Hey, since Mom and Dad got the dinner bill, can you Venmo me $500 for the celebratory champagne? You have disposable income since you just rent. Thanks, sis. I stared at the message, reading the sheer audacity of his words. He had just been handed $100,000, and he was still asking me to fund his luxury lifestyle. I did not reply. I went into my phone settings, clicked on Connor's contact profile, and hit block. I then did the exact same thing for my mother and my father. The digital severing of our ties felt permanent and incredibly satisfying. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, but then paused. I picked it back up and opened the digital app store. I typed in the name of a real estate investment and property management platform I had been reading about in financial journals. I downloaded the app, watching the loading circle complete. They wanted me to rent somewhere. They thought I was just a sad single girl with a spreadsheet. They had absolutely no idea what kind of monster they had just created. I put the car in gear and drove out of the garage, the city lights reflecting in my rearview mirror. It was a defining moment for my future path. The next morning, I woke up with a relentless focus that consumed my thoughts. My mother had told me to just rent somewhere, a cruel dismissal meant to keep me in my place. But I decided to take her malicious advice as a literal blueprint for my financial revenge. If they thought I was destined to be nothing more than a sad renter with a spreadsheet, I would become the most ruthless renter the city of Chicago had ever seen. The first step was to drastically minimize my living expenses to maximize my capital. At the time, I was living in a comfortable, mid-range one-bedroom apartment that reflected my steady corporate salary. I broke my lease that week, paying the penalty without a second thought, because the long-term return on this sacrifice would far outweigh the temporary cost. I spent my evenings scouring online classifieds for the cheapest housing available within a reasonable commute to my downtown office. I was not looking for charm, safety, or modern amenities. I was looking for rock-bottom rent. I found it in a damp, run-down studio apartment in a neglected industrial neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The building smelled faintly of industrial cleaning supplies. The linoleum floors were peeling at the corners, and the single window looked out onto a brick wall adorned with faded graffiti. It was bleak, cramped, and entirely devoid of comfort. When I signed the lease, the property manager looked at my corporate attire with genuine confusion, wondering why a sharply dressed analyst was moving into a building where half the tenants paid rent in cash weekly. I just smiled, signed my name on the dotted line, and handed over my first month's rent. Living in that studio was a daily test of my endurance, but it fueled my ambition. Every time I shivered from the drafty window or listened to the loud arguments from the apartment upstairs, I thought of Connor holding that giant check. I thought of my parents smiling as they funded his extravagant lifestyle with my rightful share of the family savings. Instead of feeling sorry for myself, I used that anger to sharpen my discipline. With my rent slashed to a mere fraction of what it used to be, And my recent promotion bumping my salary into the low six figures, my bank account began to grow at an astonishing rate. I was aggressively hoarding cash, living on rice and beans, taking the bus, and wearing the same 5 work outfits in rotation. My weekends were completely repurposed. I treated real estate investing like a second full-time job. I spent my Saturdays at the public library reading every book I could find on property management, real estate law, and distressed asset acquisition. I learned how to analyze market trends, calculate repair costs, and evaluate rental yields. I created complex, multi-tabbed spreadsheets that tracked every foreclosure auction, tax sale, and bank-owned property in the greater metropolitan area. On Sundays, I drove around working-class neighborhoods, looking for neglected houses with peeling paint, taking meticulous notes on neighborhood developments and zoning changes. I started attending municipal foreclosure auctions just to observe the process. I stood in the back of stuffy county courtrooms, watching seasoned investors bid thousands of dollars in cash on properties they had never even stepped foot inside. I studied their strategies and waited patiently for my moment. I refused to let impatience ruin my plan. I needed the perfect opportunity, a property that frightened away the casual buyers, but possessed solid fundamental value underneath the grime. Exactly 6 months after that humiliating birthday dinner, my moment finally arrived. It was a bleak morning in early April, and I was attending a poorly advertised bank auction for a property that had languished in foreclosure for nearly 2 years. It was a rundown duplex in a transitional neighborhood, starting to see early signs of revitalization. From the outside, the property looked like a complete disaster. The roof was missing shingles, the front porch was visibly sagging, and the yard was a jungle of weeds and discarded debris. The interior photos provided by the bank showed severe cosmetic damage holes in the drywall and outdated plumbing. The other investors at the auction took one look at the property packet and passed, unwilling to take on the massive amount of manual labor required to make the building habitable. But my spreadsheets told a different story. The foundation was solid, the neighborhood was situated near a planned public transit expansion, and the purchase price was shockingly low. I raised my bidding paddle, my hand steady, and won the auction without a single competing bid. I used the cash I had saved from slumming it in my studio to cover the down payment and secure the financing. The moment the keys were placed in my hand, a profound sense of power washed over me. I finally owned something tangible that belonged entirely to me, and my family had absolutely no idea. I moved out of the cramped studio and into the left half of the duplex. The heat barely worked, and I had to sleep on an air mattress in the living room while I tackled the renovations. But I did not care, because this dirt and grime belonged to me. For the next 4 months, I lived a grueling double life. By day, I was the polished, efficient supply chain analyst, analyzing corporate logistics and leading boardroom meetings. By night, and all through the weekend, I was a demolition crew, a painter, and a carpenter. I watched hundreds of online tutorials on drywall repair and basic plumbing. I wore heavy denim overalls, covered in paint splatters and dust, hauling massive bags of debris to the dumpster out back. I completely gutted the right half of the duplex, tearing up the filthy carpets to reveal salvageable hardwood floors. I sanded them down by hand, breathing in sawdust until my lungs ached. I painted the walls a crisp, modern white, replaced the outdated kitchen cabinets with discounted models I found at a surplus warehouse, and installed new, energy-efficient appliances. My hands were blistered, my back ached perpetually, and I rarely slept more than 5 hours a night. Yet I had never felt more alive. Every swing of the hammer was a strike against the narrative my parents had forced upon me. Every newly painted room was a step further away from their control. As the renovations neared completion, I knew I needed to protect my growing asset. The last thing I wanted was for my parents or Connor to somehow discover my name on public property records. If they knew I had capital, they would immediately swoop in demanding financial assistance for Connor's endless emergencies under the guise of family loyalty. I needed a shield, a corporate veil to keep my identity completely hidden from anyone who might come looking. I hired a business attorney who specialized in real estate privacy. Together, we navigated the legal framework required to establish a blind, limited liability company. We filed the paperwork using registered agents and proxy addresses, ensuring that any public search of the property ownership would lead to a corporate dead end rather than my personal name. I sat in the attorney's polished office, carefully signing the thick stack of incorporation documents. When the attorney asked what I wanted to name the holding company, I did not even have to think about it. Apex Skyline Holdings, I said, my voice ringing with quiet authority. It represented the heights I was going to reach built entirely in the shadows. The attorney stamped the final legal seal, officially bringing my secret empire into existence. I walked out of that office with my legal shield securely in place. I was no longer just Madeline, the discarded younger daughter who was told to rent somewhere. I was the sole owner of Apex Skyline Holdings, and I was holding the keys to my first successful investment. The right half of the duplex was modern and ready for the rental market. I had successfully turned my mother's cruel insult into the foundation of my wealth. I was completely hidden, financially secure, and perfectly positioned to take the next major step. 3 weeks after I finalized the paperwork for Apex Skyline Holdings, the stark contrast between my private reality and my brother's very public life became almost comical. Connor and Vanessa had officially closed on their dream home, a sprawling $600,000 suburban McMansion located in one of the most pretentious subdivisions outside the city. The house was a monument to their unchecked vanity. It featured 5 bedrooms, a massive 3-car garage, and a 2-story foyer with a ridiculous crystal chandelier. Of course, they could not actually afford any of it. My parents had drained a massive portion of their own retirement savings, handing over that novelty check and securing the mortgage under conditions they would never openly admit. Connor was playing the role of a highly successful family man, while my parents played the roles of wealthy, benevolent benefactors. Meanwhile, I was living in the unrenovated left half of my duplex. My side of the building was still rough around the edges. The exterior paint was chipping, the front porch groaned under heavy footsteps, and the landscaping consisted mostly of stubborn dandelions pushing through cracked concrete. I intentionally left the exterior looking slightly neglected, as the perfect camouflage. To the outside world, and more importantly to my family, I was just a struggling analyst renting a cheap, depressing unit. They had no idea I held the deed to the entire property. I was spending a quiet Saturday morning sitting at my small kitchen table, reviewing tenant applications for the newly renovated right half of the duplex. I had a cup of black coffee in one hand and a highlighter in the other. I was meticulously running background checks and verifying income statements when a loud, aggressive knock echoed from my front door. I frowned, setting my pen down. I was not expecting anyone, and my neighbors generally kept to themselves. I walked through the dim living room and peered through the peephole. My heart immediately sank, followed by a sharp spike of irritation. Standing on my uneven wooden porch were my father Richard and my mother Patricia. My mother was wearing a pristine beige trench coat and holding a designer handbag tightly against her chest, looking around the neighborhood with an expression of profound disgust. My father was frowning at the chipped paint on the doorframe. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my faded gray sweater, and opened the door. "Mom? Dad?" I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "What are you doing here? I did not give you this address." My father pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. "Connor forwarded us the address from a package that accidentally went to his house last week," he said, looking around my sparse living room with undisguised contempt. We decided it was time we finally saw how you were living, and frankly, Madeline, we are appalled. My mother stepped inside cautiously, as if the very air in my apartment might infect her. She refused to take off her shoes, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the scratched linoleum floor. She looked at the bare walls, the simple air mattress I had propped in the corner, and the small folding table I used as a desk. She let out a long, dramatic sigh, shaking her head. "Madeline, this is absolutely tragic," my mother said, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. "Look at how you are living. This place is a complete slum. It smells like damp wood and cheap cooking oil. When I told you to rent somewhere, I did not mean you had to punish yourself by moving into poverty. You have a decent corporate job. Why on earth are you subjecting yourself to this sad renting lifestyle?" I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms. "I like to keep my overhead low," I replied calmly. "It allows me to save my money." "Save your money for what?" my father scoffed, running a finger along the edge of a dusty windowsill. "You have no family to provide for. You have no real assets. You are just hoarding cash while living like a peasant. It is embarrassing, Madeline, truly embarrassing. What if one of our friends drove past this neighborhood and saw you walking out of this dilapidated building? How do you think that reflects on us?" I stared at him, marveling at his absolute lack of self-awareness. "You do not need to worry about your friends seeing me, Dad. I doubt any of them venture into this part of the city. Why are you really here? You did not drive 45 minutes out of your way on a Saturday morning just to critique my interior decorating." My parents exchanged a meaningful glance. My mother stepped forward, her expression shifting from disgust to that familiar, demanding superiority she always used when she wanted something. "We are here because we need to discuss Connor's new house," my mother said smoothly. "As you know, your brother and Vanessa have just moved into a beautiful new estate. It is a massive step forward for the family legacy. However, the builder-grade landscaping the developers left behind is simply unacceptable. The backyard is completely bare, and the front lawn lacks any kind of curb appeal. Vanessa is very distressed about it. They need professional landscaping immediately before they host their housewarming party next month." I blinked, genuinely confused for a fraction of a second. "Okay, so tell them to hire a landscaper. What does that have to do with me?" My father crossed his arms, staring me down. "Professional landscaping for a property of that magnitude is expensive, Madeline. They received quotes upwards of $20,000 for the custom patio and the imported shrubbery Vanessa wants. Your mother and I have already contributed significantly to their down payment, and Connor's liquid cash is tied up in new furniture for the interior. We expect you to contribute $5,000 to his landscaping fund." The silence that followed was absolute. I looked from my father to my mother, waiting for the punchline of a joke that was not coming. They were entirely serious. They had tracked down my address, driven to my home, insulted my living conditions, and were now demanding $5,000 to plant expensive bushes in the yard of a mansion my brother could not even afford. "You want me to give Connor $5,000 for landscaping?" I repeated, making sure I heard the sheer absurdity of the request correctly. My mother sighed, rolling her eyes. "Do not make this difficult, Madeline. You just said yourself that you are saving all your money because your rent is so cheap. You are living in a slum with absolutely zero financial responsibilities. It is the least you can do to help your brother establish his home. It is a matter of family pride. We cannot have him hosting clients and friends with a dirt patch for a backyard." I let out a short, hollow laugh. "Let me get this straight. You handed him $100,000 of family money on my birthday. You completely drained the account that was supposed to be split between us. Now you track me down to this apartment, insult my life, and demand that I empty my hard-earned savings so his wife can have a custom patio." "It is an investment in the family legacy," my father barked, stepping closer. "You should be proud to help him. You certainly do not need the money sitting in some bank account while you live in this dump. You will wire the $5,000 to Connor's account by Monday morning. I stood up straight, dropping my arms to my sides. I looked my father dead in the eye, feeling the solid weight of the property deed invisible beneath my feet. No, I said. The word was sharp, clean, and absolutely final. My mother gasped in sheer outrage as my father turned bright red. "You ungrateful brat!" he yelled, turning toward the door. "We are leaving!" They stormed out in intense anger. Seconds later, my phone rang. My real estate broker confirmed the tenant application cleared, fully covering my mortgage. The empire had officially begun today. Time has a funny way of accelerating when you are completely consumed by a singular purpose. 3 full years had passed since the morning my parents stood on my sagging front porch and demanded my hard-earned money for my brother's landscaping. I am 31 years old now, and the landscape of my life looks drastically different, even if the surface appears completely unchanged. To my family, I was still the stubborn, difficult daughter who refused to help her brother and insisted on renting a sad little apartment in a transitioning neighborhood. I never corrected them. I let them believe whatever made them feel superior, because their ignorance was the greatest shield I could ever ask for. Behind the safety of my corporate veil, Apex Skyline Holdings was thriving. The duplex had been the perfect launching pad. After 18 months of collecting steady rental income from both halves of the building, I had built up enough equity to approach a commercial lender. I sat in a sleek conference room overlooking the city, presenting my meticulous spreadsheets to a loan officer. I showed him the property appreciation, the reliable cash flow, and my pristine personal credit score. I took out a home equity line of credit against the duplex and used it as the down payment for my next major acquisition. It was a beautiful brick fourplex located just 3 miles away from my first property. The building had been severely mismanaged by an out-of-state landlord for over a decade. The tenants were frustrated, the general maintenance was deferred, and the curb appeal was practically non-existent. I saw nothing but pure potential. I closed on the fourplex in late autumn and immediately went to work. This time, I did not have to sleep on an air mattress or sand hardwood floors until my hands bled. I used the revenue generated by my first property to hire a highly reliable crew of professional contractors. We replaced the failing roof, updated the electrical panels, and modernized the kitchens in all 4 units. I raised the rents to match the current market rate, and within 2 months, the building was fully occupied and generating a massive positive cash flow. I did not stop there. The momentum was entirely intoxicating. Less than a year after securing the fourplex, I found another extremely distressed asset. It was a historic but neglected 6-unit apartment building, located right near a rapidly growing university campus. The strategy was identical to my previous success. I leveraged the equity from my existing portfolio, secured the new financing through Apex Skyline Holdings, and transformed the entire property into premium student housing. By the time I celebrated my 31st birthday, I was effectively managing a dozen rental units across the city. My corporate job as a supply chain analyst was now just a secondary income stream, providing me with excellent health benefits and a highly convenient cover story for my family. While I was quietly building generational wealth in the shadows, my brother Connor was loudly spending money he did not actually have. His lifestyle had wildly inflated over those same 3 years, ballooning into a grotesque caricature of suburban success. Despite still working the exact same mediocre sales job that barely met his monthly quotas, Connor and Vanessa were determined to look like millionaires to anyone who would pay attention. They traded in their highly practical sedans for 2 brand-new, top-of-the-line luxury sport utility vehicles. They threw extravagant parties at their house, hiring private caterers and live string quartets just to impress their neighbors and colleagues. Their social media feeds were a constant barrage of lavish vacations. I would occasionally look at their public profiles just to observe the sheer delusion of it all. There were photos of them skiing in Aspen, drinking expensive champagne on a private balcony in Paris, and lounging on the pristine white sands of Bora Bora. The absolute crown jewel of Connor's midlife crisis arrived the summer directly after I bought the fourplex. He actually purchased a 25-foot recreational speedboat. He named it the Golden Boy, an incredibly ironic choice that he thought was hilarious, completely missing the absolute truth behind the moniker. He docked it at a highly exclusive marina downtown, paying exorbitant slip fees just so he could host weekend drinking parties for his superficial friends. Anyone with basic mathematical skills could look at Connor's career trajectory and realize the math was absolutely not adding up. There was no physical way his modest salary could possibly support a $600,000 mortgage, 2 luxury vehicle leases, international travel, and an expensive boat. The truth was dark and painfully predictable. Richard and Patricia were actively funding his entire existence. I pieced the reality together through casual conversations with my Aunt Linda, who loved to gossip, and my own sharp intuition. My parents were absolutely desperate to maintain the pristine facade of Connor's success. To their country club friends, Connor was a brilliant businessman, a living testament to their excellent parenting. They simply could not bear the social humiliation of watching him fail. So they became his permanent bank. Whenever the high-interest credit card bills piled up from Vanessa's weekly designer shopping sprees, my mother would quietly write a personal check to clear the massive balance. When the marina threatened to impound the new boat for missed slip payments, my father covered the exorbitant fees without a single word of protest. They were steadily and systematically dipping into their own hard-earned retirement accounts to keep Connor completely afloat. My father, who had always prided himself on his extremely conservative financial planning, was actively liquidating his stock portfolios and withdrawing cash directly from his pension fund. They were blindly trading their future security for Connor's present vanity. It was a slow-motion train wreck, and my parents were the ones eagerly shoveling coal right into the engine. Whenever I had to endure mandatory family functions, which I strictly limited to major holidays, the dynamic was completely suffocating. My parents would loudly praise Connor's entirely fictitious business acumen. They would proudly brag to the extended family about his new boat or the beautiful photos from their recent trip to France. And then, without fail, they would turn their highly critical gaze directly toward me. They would ask when I was going to move out of that terrible neighborhood, or when I was going to stop hoarding my analyst salary and actually live a little. They looked at my plain, unbranded clothes and my 5-year-old car with absolute disdain, completely unaware that my personal net worth had quietly eclipsed theirs over a year ago. I simply smiled politely, offered non-committal answers, and let them continue their ridiculous performance. I knew that every single dollar they threw into the black hole of Connor's chaotic life was a dollar they were actively stealing from their own retirement. They were enabling his financial destruction because their own fragile egos depended entirely on his false success. They desperately wanted to believe that handing him $100,000 on my birthday had been a brilliant investment in the family legacy. Openly admitting that he was actually a complete financial disaster would mean admitting they had been incredibly wrong about absolutely everything. It would mean openly admitting they had foolishly bet their entire future on the wrong child. I sat back and watched the inevitable collapse slowly approach. I continued to strategically reinvest my rental profits directly into Apex Skyline Holdings, letting the steady magic of compound interest and property appreciation work beautifully in my favor. I was now completely independent, operating happily outside their toxic financial web. My expanding portfolio was rapidly appreciating. My dedicated tenants were paying down my mortgages, and my cash reserves were growing exponentially. Meanwhile, my parents were quietly bleeding themselves dry to polish a golden child who was completely rusting inside. They thought they were securing their legacy, but they were only financing their own eventual ruin. As my wealth multiplied unseen, the stage was perfectly set for a catastrophic financial reckoning, and I had secured the absolute best seat in the entire house to watch it happen. As autumn approached, the crisp Chicago air brought the inevitable dread of the holiday season. I usually kept my interactions with my family limited to brief phone calls, but Thanksgiving was always a mandatory performance. I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing a contractor bid for my latest property acquisition, when my phone rang. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name. I took a deep breath, braced myself for whatever demand was coming, and answered it. Patricia did not bother with pleasantries. She launched immediately into a frantic monologue about the upcoming holiday. She complained about how exhausting it was to coordinate with our extended family, listing off all the aunts, uncles, and cousins who would be attending. I listened passively, waiting for the real reason behind her call. Then she dropped the demand. Madeline, we have decided that you will be hosting Thanksgiving dinner at your apartment this year, my mother stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. I stopped reviewing my contractor bid and stared at the phone. You want me to host 20 people in my duplex? Mom, you and Dad have a massive dining room, and Cotter has a $600,000 house with a custom patio you basically paid for. Why would I host? My mother let out an exaggerated sigh. Connor and Vanessa's home is simply too pristine to be ruined by a dozen rowdy children running around with sticky hands. Vanessa just bought a white velvet sectional, and she is terribly anxious about cranberry sauce stains. Your place is already well lived in. A few spills on your cheap floors will not matter. Plus, it is time you stepped up and contributed to the family instead of just taking. I felt a familiar spark of anger, but I quickly suppressed it. The audacity was breathtaking. They wanted to cram 20 people into the unrenovated half of my duplex, forcing me to cook, clean, and serve them all to protect the pristine illusion of Connor's wealth. They wanted to use me as their unpaid maid so the golden boy would not lift a finger. No, I said, keeping my voice entirely calm and measured. I will not be hosting Thanksgiving, Mom. My apartment is not a designated spill zone for Connor's convenience. Excuse me? My mother snapped, her voice rising in pitch. You do not get to say no, Madeline. You are being incredibly selfish. Connor works very hard to maintain his beautiful home. Then he can work hard to host his own family, I replied smoothly. I am not doing it. If you do not want to host and Connor refuses to host, we can all go to a restaurant. But my door will remain closed on Thanksgiving. You are a bitter, ungrateful girl, she yelled through the speaker. Do not bother showing up to dinner wherever we have it. You are uninvited. She slammed the phone down, abruptly ending the call. I set my phone on the table, feeling a deep sense of relief. Setting that firm boundary felt like breathing pure oxygen. Of course, my refusal to play the obedient scapegoat did not go unpunished. The retaliation began less than 48 hours later. I was at my corporate office finishing up a supply chain report when my desk phone rang. It was my Aunt Linda. Linda was my father's sister, a woman who thrived on family drama and considered herself the ultimate source of family news. Madeline, sweetie, I am just calling to check on you, Linda said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. I heard the terrible news, and I want you to know that your uncle and I are praying for you. I frowned, leaning back in my office chair. What terrible news, Aunt Linda? I am doing perfectly fine. Oh, honey, you do not have to hide it from me, she whispered conspiratorially. Connor told us everything. He said you refused to host Thanksgiving because you are completely drowning in credit card debt, and your landlord is threatening you with eviction. He said you could not even afford to buy a turkey. I closed my eyes, letting the absolute absurdity of the lie wash over me. Connor was spreading malicious rumors to the extended family to cover up the fact that I had simply told them no. He was painting me as a destitute failure facing eviction, unaware I was actually a multimillionaire landlord who owned the very building he claimed I was evicted from. "Connor told you I was being evicted?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral to encourage her to keep talking. "Yes, he was so worried about you," Linda continued, eager to share the gossip. "He said you have been hiding from the family because you are so ashamed of your financial situation. Your mother was just in tears about it. She said she offered to help you, but you were too proud to accept." They were rewriting history to make themselves look like the benevolent, concerned family while casting me as the tragic failure. It was a classic deflection tactic. If the family was focused on my fabricated financial ruin, no one would look too closely at the cracks forming in Connor's facade. "Thank you for your concern, Aunt Linda," I said, my voice steady. "But please do not worry about me. I am paying my bills just fine." Connor must have misunderstood my situation. I hung up the phone and simply smiled. Connor was projecting his own insecurities onto me. If he was spreading rumors about credit card debt and eviction, it meant those specific fears were currently keeping him awake at night. The golden child was starting to feel the heat. I decided to let them spin their lies. I did not try to correct the extended family or defend myself. I knew that the truth would eventually reveal itself in the most devastating way possible, and I was content to wait in the shadows. As November rolled into its final weeks, the silence from my parents and brother was absolute. I assumed they were simply punishing me with the silent treatment for ruining their holiday plans. I was perfectly happy to enjoy a quiet, drama-free Thanksgiving weekend in my beautifully renovated duplex. I spent the holiday organizing my property portfolio and reviewing my rapidly growing investment accounts, but the illusion of peace was shattered the following Monday morning. I was sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee, preparing for a morning meeting, when my personal cell phone buzzed violently. It was an automated text message from my primary banking institution. The message warned of suspicious activity and requested that I immediately call the fraud prevention department. My heart rate spiked. As someone who managed a dozen rental properties, financial security was my absolute top priority. I excused myself from the office, stepped into a quiet hallway, and dialed the bank's secure hotline. After verifying my identity with the representative, the details of the security breach sent a chill straight down my spine. "Miss Hayes," the bank representative, said we detected multiple failed attempts to access your checking and savings accounts late last night. The individual attempted to initiate a wire transfer of $12,000 to an external account. $12,000? I repeated, my grip tightening on the phone. Did the transfer go through? Who was trying to access my money? The transfer was automatically blocked because the individual failed the secondary security questions, the representative assured me. However, the login was attempted using an old, legacy account profile that was attached to your childhood's Social Security credentials. The IP address originated from a residential network in the Chicago suburbs. The blood drained from my face. My childhood Social Security credentials, the Chicago suburbs. The bank was describing my parents. Richard and Patricia had actively attempted to hack into my bank accounts. I asked the representative whether the attempted transfer record contained a merchant or beneficiary descriptor that I was legally entitled to see as the account holder. She opened a fraud case and directed me to the secure incident report in my online banking portal. The blocked transaction showed the destination descriptor clearly, a local luxury marine storage facility, the exact marina where Connor kept his 25-foot speedboat. The horrific reality of the situation crashed over me. Connor was in a sudden, massive cash flow crisis. The marina was clearly demanding their past-due slip fees, threatening to impound his beloved boat. Richard and Patricia must have completely drained their own liquid assets to the point where they could no longer bail him out. In a moment of pure desperation, they had tried to use my old childhood banking information to break into my accounts. They were hoping to borrow my money without my permission to cover Connor's debts. They actually believed that the daughter they had told to rent somewhere, the daughter they had publicly humiliated and called a failure, would be the perfect victim for their financial theft. They thought I was weak. They thought I was foolish. They thought I was an easy target. I instructed the bank to permanently freeze all legacy access points, issue new account numbers, and place the highest level of biometric security on every single transaction. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from an overwhelming, burning rage. The line had not just been crossed, it had been entirely obliterated. The silent war had begun today. The silent war began with paperwork, not shouting. The morning after the attempted transfer, I called the business attorney who had helped me establish Apex Skyline Holdings. I sent her the fraud alert, the bank's incident number screenshots of the failed login attempts, and copies of the old custodial account records that connected my parents to the legacy profile. She listened without interrupting, then told me exactly what I already knew in my gut. This was no longer ordinary family manipulation. Someone had tried to gain unauthorized access to my money, and I needed to treat the threat as a legal and operational risk. By then, I was 33 years old. I had spent 5 years learning that every boundary my family could not control would be tested. Blocking their phone numbers had not been enough. Refusing their demands had not been enough. They had moved from insults to rumors, then from rumors to attempted financial access. I was done relying on goodwill from people who had never shown me any. I asked my attorney to build a wall they could not talk, cry, or bully their way through. Within 48 hours, she sent Richard and Patricia a formal cease and desist letter by certified mail. It identified the attempted access, ordered them to stop using or retaining any of my financial information, prohibited them from contacting my banks, employer, tenants, contractors, or property managers, and warned that any further interference would be documented for civil and criminal referral. The letter did not accuse them of conduct we could not yet prove. It did something more effective. It listed the evidence we had preserved my rights and made the consequences of another attempt unmistakably clear. I also filed an identity theft report, placed extended fraud alerts with the major credit bureaus, froze my credit, changed every account number connected to the old profile, and moved my personal reserves to a new institution that had never handled a family-linked account. My bank added verbal passcodes and device restrictions. Apex Skyline Holdings already operated through separate business accounts, but I ordered a complete security review there as well. My property manager, accountant, broker, and attorney received written instructions that no relative of mine had authority to request records, approve payments, enter a property, or speak on behalf of the company. My parents responded exactly as expected. Patricia left a trembling voicemail from an unfamiliar number, insisting the transfer had been a misunderstanding and accusing me of humiliating them with a lawyer's letter. Richard sent one furious email, claiming parents could not steal from their own child and demanding that I withdraw the notice before the family heard about it. I did not answer either message. My attorney sent a single acknowledgement, confirming that all further communication had to go through her office. That was the beginning of genuine, low contact, no arguments, no explanations, and no private conversations they could later rewrite. They immediately rewrote the story anyway. According to Aunt Linda, my mother told relatives I had become paranoid and cruel after earning a modest promotion. My father claimed I had hired an expensive attorney to threaten 2 innocent retirees because they had asked me to help Connor. They presented themselves as heartbroken parents and described me as a cold daughter hoarding an analyst's salary in a dangerous rental. I let them talk. Every false version protected the truth they were too arrogant to investigate. While they spent their energy managing appearances, I fortified the empire they still believed did not exist. The duplex had taught me how to evaluate distressed properties, control renovation costs, screen tenants, and protect cash flow. The fourplex and the university building had taught me how to delegate. I stopped trying to perform every repair myself and built a disciplined team, a general contractor who respected budgets, a property manager who documented everything, an accountant who understood real estate taxation, and an attorney who reviewed every acquisition before I signed. Over the next 2 years, Apex Skyline Holdings acquired a carefully selected mix of small apartment buildings, duplexes, and neighborhood commercial spaces. I did not buy for attention. I bought where the numbers worked: strong transit access, stable employment nearby, manageable deferred maintenance, and enough demand to support responsible rent increases after genuine improvements. I refinanced only when the properties could safely carry the debt. I kept reserves for roofs, boilers, vacancies, and legal costs. Connor chased the appearance of wealth. I built systems that could survive bad months. By my 33rd birthday, Apex Skyline Holdings owned 12 profitable properties across Chicago. Some were still modest brick buildings in working-class neighborhoods. Others had become polished mixed-use assets, with cafes or professional offices below, renovated apartments. Each one produced income appreciated quietly and paid down its own debt. My tenants knew the company name, not my family history. My relatives still pictured me sleeping beside a peeling wall in a duplex I supposedly rented. The most ambitious project sat in the downtown arts district. I had purchased a neglected parcel through a lender's sale after a previous developer abandoned it. The location was exceptional, but the financing and construction schedule frightened away smaller investors. I spent months reviewing zoning, environmental reports, contractor bids, and demand projections. Then I brought in a conservative construction loan, retained full ownership through Apex Skyline Holdings, and broke ground on a private collection of ultra-luxury townhomes. I was personally involved in every major design decision. The units had rooftop terraces, private elevators, secure parking, sound-insulated walls, and restrained finishes that felt expensive without becoming gaudy. I chose durable imported stone for the kitchens, commercial-grade systems behind the walls, and layouts that would appeal to executives who wanted privacy in the center of the city. The project was not a vanity monument. It was a premium asset, built to generate reliable, long-term income. I also adopted written operating rules that separated compassion from risk. Rent concessions required documented hardship and approval from the management team. Vendor changes required 2 signatures. Any unusual payment request triggered a second review. Those controls were not dramatic, but they prevented the kind of informal exceptions my family had always exploited. I wanted every tenant, contractor, and employee treated by the same standards, including anyone connected to me by blood. The Arts District project strengthened that discipline. Construction delays forced me to renegotiate delivery schedules to replace one unreliable subcontractor and protect the loan reserve without sacrificing safety. My supply chain experience became an unexpected advantage. I understood procurement contingency planning and how one weak vendor could endanger an entire system. By the time the final units were ready, the project had passed every inspection, remained within its revised budget, and attracted qualified applicants before the marketing campaign officially launched. It was the clearest proof that my so-called little spreadsheets had become a real competitive advantage. Those results proved disciplined systems could protect growth assets, employees, tenants, and every future decision. When the final inspection passed, I stood alone inside the premier corner unit and looked through the tall windows at the Chicago skyline. 5 years earlier, my parents had announced that I did not need a home because I was single. Now, I owned an entire complex of homes they could not have qualified to rent. I did not post photographs. I did not call Aunt Linda. I simply authorized my management team to begin accepting applications under the same objective standards used across the rest of my portfolio. The cease and desist letter, the security measures, and the expanding company changed something fundamental in me. I no longer felt as though I were hiding because I was afraid. I was choosing privacy because it protected what I had built. Richard, Patricia, and Connor could complain about their cold, ungrateful daughter as loudly as they wanted. They had no access to my accounts, no authority over my company, and no idea that the strongest asset in the premier downtown district belonged to me. By the time winter thawed into spring, their safety net was gone. My defenses were complete, and the first public cracks in Connor's perfect life were finally beginning to show. As winter thawed into spring, the consequences of their financial recklessness began to surface in increasingly public ways. The cracks in Connor's pristine facade started small, almost imperceptible to anyone who was not watching closely. His constant social media posts about expensive dinners, weekend trips, and luxury purchases abruptly stopped. Vanessa's weekly designer shopping photographs disappeared. Then came the whispers from the extended family. Cousin David mentioned at a spring barbecue that Connor had quietly asked to borrow several $1,000s for a supposedly unexpected tax bill. The supposed sales prodigy was asking relatives for petty cash. His house of cards was actively collapsing. The real humiliation arrived in May. I found out through a mutual acquaintance who worked at the downtown luxury marina. Connor had stopped paying his slip fees for his precious 25-foot speedboat, the Golden Boy. He had ignored months of past due notices, assuming my parents would eventually swoop in and clear the balance just like they always did. But my parents had nothing left to give him. They had drained their checking accounts, maxed out their credit cards, and pulled heavily from their retirement funds to cover his exorbitant mortgage payments during the winter. When the marina ran out of patience, they initiated a formal and highly visible repossession. On a busy Saturday afternoon, right in front of Connor's wealthy friends, a commercial towing crew arrived at the dock. They hitched up the Golden Boy, pulled it out of the water, and hauled it away. The public embarrassment must have been suffocating for him. Following the loss of the boat, the vehicle leases were the next domino to fall. Connor and Vanessa had been leasing 2 luxury sport utility vehicles to maintain their illusion of success. Without my parents there to secretly write the monthly checks, the leasing company acted swiftly. One crisp morning, Vanessa walked out to find an empty driveway. Both vehicles had been quietly repossessed in the dead of night. They were suddenly trapped in their massive house, with no cars, no boat, and no way to hide their utter financial ruin from their judgmental neighbors. The desperation reached its peak weeks later. I was sitting in my home office analyzing a commercial property near the financial district when my phone rang. It was Aunt Linda. I almost sent the call to voicemail, but a sharp instinct told me this was not another casual gossip session. I answered. "Madeline, you need to tell me what is going on with your brother, right now," Linda said, her voice frantic. "He just called your uncle and me, and he was completely hysterical." I set my pen down. "What did he say, Aunt Linda? He begged us for a $10,000 loan?" she exclaimed. "He said he was facing a cash flow issue and needed the money immediately to cover a vital business expense." "But then he started crying, Madeline. Connor never cries. He told us that you have hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in the bank, and that you are a selfish, greedy hoarder who absolutely refuses to help your own blood. He said you are letting him drown just to be cruel." I closed eyes, letting out a slow breath. The sheer audacity of his lies was almost impressive. Even as his life fell apart around him, he was still trying to use me as his dedicated scapegoat, manipulating our extended family into emptying their own pockets by painting me as the heartless villain. "Connor is lying to you, Aunt Linda," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I do not know what kind of financial trouble he is in, but it is not my responsibility to bail him out. He makes his own choices and he is a grown man. Do not give him a single dollar. He will never pay you back." Linda let out a shaky sigh. "I know, honey. We firmly told him no. Your uncle was furious that he even asked. But your mother called me right after he did. She was sobbing uncontrollably, begging us to reconsider the loan. She said they have given him everything they have and they are completely tapped out. If we do not help him, he is going to lose the house." I thanked Aunt Linda for the information and ended the call. The puzzle pieces perfectly locked into place. My parents had bled themselves dry for him. They had sacrificed their financial security, their retirement, and their dignity to prop up his false reality. And now the money was gone. There was no one left to save him. That week, I had a scheduled meeting with a general contractor to review a renovation bid for a new property acquisition. The property happened to be located in the same general suburb as Connor's sprawling estate. It was a beautiful Thursday afternoon. The sun was shining, and the neighborhood looked like a pristine television commercial. After my meeting wrapped up, I found myself driving down the main arterial road that led directly past my brother's subdivision. I did not plan to drive past his house, but as I approached the familiar stone entrance of his gated community, a strange sense of curiosity pulled at the steering wheel. I turned into the neighborhood, driving slowly down the wide, quiet streets lined with massive houses. As I rolled down his block, I spotted his house in the distance. The front lawn, the same lawn my parents had demanded I pay $5,000 to landscape, was overgrown and choked with thick weeds. The custom patio furniture they had bragged about was gone, likely sold for quick cash. The driveway was empty, a testament to the repossessed vehicles. I pulled my car over to the curb, parking a few houses down, and just watched. The house looked utterly lifeless. The blinds were drawn tightly shut, and there was a noticeable pile of uncollected mail out of the brass mailbox by the front door. As I sat with my engine idling, a plain white sedan pulled into the driveway. A man wearing a cheap gray suit and carrying a clipboard stepped out of the vehicle. He walked briskly up the paved walkway to my brother's front porch. I watched intently as the man pulled a roll of bright orange tape from his pocket. He took a large, brightly colored document from his clipboard, slapped it directly onto the center of Connor's heavy oak front door, and taped it down securely. He snapped a quick photograph of the door with his phone turned around and walked back to his car. The moment the white sedan drove away, the front door of the house violently swung open. Connor stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing wrinkled sweatpants and a stained shirt, looking disheveled and frantic. He ripped the orange document off the door, tearing the tape in his haste. He looked around the neighborhood with wild, paranoid eyes, desperate to see if any of his wealthy neighbors had witnessed the delivery. He crumpled the paper in his hands and retreated back inside, slamming the door shut behind him. I sat in my car staring at the empty porch. I did not need to walk up there to read the document. As a seasoned real estate investor, I knew exactly what that bright orange paper was. It was a formal pre-foreclosure notice from the bank. The golden child was officially losing his mansion. The golden child was officially losing his mansion. I sat in my car, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, completely mesmerized by the sheer panic radiating from my older brother. He stood on his sprawling front porch, frantically smoothing out the crumpled, bright orange pre-foreclosure notice, looking around as if the neighborhood watch was going to descend upon him at any moment. I did not feel any urge to roll down my window and reveal myself. I simply put my car into drive and slowly pulled away from the curb, leaving Connor alone with the devastating reality of his own financial collapse. I expected the fallout to be dramatic. I anticipated tearful phone calls from my parents, begging the extended family for loans or perhaps a sudden quiet disappearance as Connor and Vanessa moved into my parents' basement in shame. But I had severely underestimated the depths of their collective delusion. They were not going to admit defeat. Instead, they decided to construct a lie so massive and so profoundly detached from reality that it almost bordered on psychological performance art. The new narrative began circulating through the family grapevine less than 2 weeks after I saw that orange notice taped to his door. It started with a highly curated post on Vanessa's social media. She posted a picture of moving boxes stacked in their grand foyer, with a caption claiming they were moving on to bigger and better things. Shortly after the phone calls began, my father Richard took it upon himself to personally update every aunt, uncle, and cousin in our extended family tree. I heard the details through my cousin David, who called me one evening while I was cooking dinner. "Did you hear the news about Connor?" David asked, sounding genuinely impressed. "Your dad just told my parents that Connor sold his house for a massive, highly profitable cash offer." I paused, setting my spatula down on the counter. "A massive cash offer?" I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "Is that what Uncle Richard is saying?" "Yes," David continued, completely unaware of the truth. "Apparently, a corporate executive from overseas saw the house and made an offer way over the asking price. Your dad said Connor and Vanessa realized the suburbs were just too isolating for their lifestyle anyway. They wanted to be closer to the downtown energy. So they took the cash and are moving back to the city." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. Too isolating. A massive cash offer. It was a spectacular piece of fiction. They were actively spinning a bank foreclosure into a brilliant real estate triumph. I thanked David for the update and hung up the phone, shaking my head in sheer disbelief. My parents were willing to lie to the entire family just to preserve the illusion that their golden boy was a financial genius. But a lie that large requires an equally large prop to sustain it. If Connor had supposedly just made hundreds of thousands of dollars on a cash real estate sale, he could not simply move into a cheap apartment or crash in his childhood bedroom. He needed a place that matched the fictional wealth my parents were bragging about. A few days later, Aunt Linda called to provide the next chapter of their delusional story. "Your mother is just absolutely glowing," Linda told me over the phone. She said Connor and Vanessa are looking to rent a luxury townhome in the premier downtown arts district. Just temporarily, of course. "Temporarily?" I asked, leaning back in my office chair. "Oh yes," Linda said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "Patricia told everyone that Connor is just renting a luxury unit for the next year while they take their time shopping for a multi-million-dollar estate. They want to make sure they find the absolute perfect mansion before they commit all that cash from the sale. Is it not wonderful how well he is doing? You must be so proud of your brother." I told Aunt Linda that I was definitely experiencing a lot of strong emotions regarding my brother, which was the most honest thing I'd said all week. After the call ended, I logged into my private property management portal. The downtown arts district. It was the exact neighborhood where I had just finished constructing a brand new, ultra-luxury townhome complex under Apex Skyline Holdings. The building featured rooftop terraces, private elevators, and imported marble finishes. I was currently taking applications for the first round of leases, targeting high-earning executives and wealthy professionals. I knew my parents and Connor were desperate. They needed a high-profile address to make their ridiculous lie believable. But they were running into a massive, unavoidable brick wall. You can lie to your aunts and uncles at a family barbecue, but you cannot lie to a corporate property management background check. To rent a luxury townhome in that specific district, applicants needed to prove a liquid income equivalent to 3 times the monthly rent. They needed impeccable credit histories, glowing references, and a flawless financial track record. Connor possessed absolutely none of those things. His credit score was completely decimated. He had 2 recent vehicle repossessions, an active foreclosure on his record, and an alarming debt-to-income ratio. I spent the next week watching my property management dashboard with intense anticipation. I had a feeling I knew exactly what they were going to do. And sure enough, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, an application popped up in my system for Unit A, the premier corner townhome in my new complex. I clicked open the digital file. The applicant names listed were Connor and Vanessa. I slowly scrolled through the digital application, analyzing the desperate financial maneuvering they had attempted. Connor had grossly inflated his salary on the application. He listed my parents' home address as his previous residence, completely omitting the suburban house that the bank was currently seizing. But the automated background check system was merciless. It pulled his actual credit report, highlighting the active foreclosure in bright red text. It flagged the twin vehicle repossessions. It showed a credit score so abysmally low that the system automatically generated a high-risk warning. As the owner of Apex Skyline Holdings, I had given my property manager strict parameters for tenant approval. Anyone with a recent foreclosure or repossession was an automatic denial. Connor's application was dead on arrival. The system generated a standard automated rejection letter and emailed it directly to the address he had provided. I sat at my desk, looking at the rejected application, and felt a profound sense of poetic justice. My parents had told me to rent somewhere because I was not worthy of a home. Now my brother was desperately trying to rent a property from me to cover up his own spectacular failure, and he was not even qualified to be my tenant. The rejection must have sent my family into an absolute tailspin of panic. Connor had already bragged to the entire extended family that he was moving into the downtown arts district. They had painted themselves into a corner with their own massive lie. They needed that luxury lease to keep the facade from completely shattering. But without a qualified co-signer who possessed excellent credit and massive cash reserves, no luxury property management company in the city was ever going to approve him. My parents had already drained their own credit lines and destroyed their liquidity to pay his mortgage for the past year. They could not co-sign for him. Their debt-to-income ratio was likely just as heavily damaged as his. There was only one person left in the entire family who had a spotless credit history, zero debt, and a steady corporate salary. There was only one person they could possibly use to secure that lease. Me. I knew they were coming for me. I could feel the desperate, frantic energy building across the city. They were going to try to force me to save them, to leverage my financial stability to prop up their golden child one last time. They thought I was still just a quiet supply chain analyst who could be bullied and intimidated into submission. They thought they could demand my signature and take my savings to pay his massive security deposit. I closed my laptop and calmly packed my briefcase. I was absolutely ready for them. The trap was perfectly set. The evidence was gathered, and the stage was prepared. I walked out of my home office, looking forward to whatever desperate ambush they were currently planning. The golden child was officially losing his mansion. Knowing that absolute truth made the following days feel surreal. I attended supply chain meetings at my office and quietly managed my real estate empire in the evenings. The automated rejection letter my software sent to Connor was the ticking clock. They had no cash reserves, terrible credit, and an active foreclosure staining their records. They were backed into a corner of their own making. I knew it was only a matter of time before their desperation pointed them directly toward me. The inevitable ambush happened on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a logistics report, when the receptionist called my extension. She explained that my parents were downstairs and insisting on seeing me immediately. I thanked her, took a slow breath, and rode the elevator down. The moment the elevator doors parted, I spotted them. Richard and Patricia were pacing near the leather seating area of the glass lobby. They looked out of place amid the sleek corporate surroundings. My father wore a wrinkled coat, his jaw clenched. My mother looked frantic, clutching a thick manila folder to her chest. As soon as she saw me, she marched across the marble floor. "Madeline, we need to speak with you right now," my mother demanded, her voice much too loud for a corporate lobby. Several colleagues turned to look. I kept my posture relaxed. "Mom, Dad, I am in the middle of my workday. You cannot just show up at my office unannounced." "This is a family emergency," my father snapped. He crossed his arms, trying to project authority, but I saw the tremor in his hands. "Your brother is in a highly sensitive transition period, and we expect you to do your part." I gestured toward a quiet corner leading them away from the reception desk. "What exactly is the emergency?" I asked. My mother let out an exaggerated sigh. "You know Connor sold his house for a massive cash offer. He and Vanessa are moving back to the city. They found the perfect luxury townhome in the premier downtown arts district. They are only going to lease it for a year while your father and I help them shop for a multi-million-dollar estate." I nodded slowly, letting her spin the beautiful lie. "That sounds great for him. So, what is the problem?" "The problem is the management company," my father interjected. "They are entirely unreasonable." Because Connor's new wealth is tied up in escrow from the house sale, the leasing agents are giving him a hard time. It is a minor bureaucratic hurdle, but the leasing agent is demanding a co-signer to secure the unit today. "And they want a $15,000 security deposit," my mother added hastily. "Because of the escrow situation, your father and I cannot access our liquid funds immediately. We need you to provide the cash and sign the lease as a guarantor." I stared at them, letting the sheer audacity of their demand hang in the air. They wanted me to empty my savings to the tune of $15,000 and attach my name to a luxury lease for a brother actively in foreclosure. $15,000, I repeated flatly. "And my signature, yes," my mother said, thrusting the manila folder toward me. Her hands were trembling. "It is just a formality, Madeline. Connor has the money. He will pay you back the exact second his escrow clears, and if he does not, I am legally responsible for a luxury townhome I do not even live in," I pointed out smoothly. "Do not be so selfish," my father hissed. "You rent a cheap box, Madeline. It is time you finally contribute to this family instead of taking up space." My mother nodded vigorously. "Your father is absolutely right. Now, your brother needs a minor favor, and you are hesitating. You live a small, insignificant life. Connor is building a massive legacy. You owe us this, Madeline." I looked at their angry faces. They were publicly humiliating me, calling my life insignificant, while begging for my money. They truly believed I was a pathetic creature who would empty her bank account just to earn a crumb of their approval. I slowly reached out and took the application packet from my mother's trembling hands. I opened the cover. The logo at the top of the page was clean, modern, and entirely familiar. Apex Skyline Holdings. I let my eyes scan the printout. The address listed was for Unit A, the premier corner townhome. It was the exact premium unit I had personally designed. The same application my automated software had rejected just 3 days ago because of Connor's abysmal credit score and active foreclosure. I stared at the paperwork, and a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. The absolute poetry of the universe was almost too beautiful to comprehend. My parents were ambushing me at my day job, demanding I pay $15,000 to Apex Skyline Holdings. They were demanding I co-sign a lease to rent my own luxury property back to my deadbeat brother. My mother saw my smile and frowned. "What is so funny?" she demanded sharply. "This is not a joke, Madeline. If we do not submit this application with a qualified co-signer and the cash deposit by Friday, they are going to lose the townhome." I slowly closed the folder and tucked it neatly under my arm. "It is not a joke at all, Mom. I am just admiring the beautiful townhome complex. It really is a premier property. Apex Skyline Holdings does excellent work." My father scowled. "Then you understand why Connor needs to secure it. Are you going to sign the paperwork and provide the deposit? Or are you going to continue being the most selfish person in this family?" I looked at my father, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him shift uncomfortably. The trap they had walked into was perfectly constructed, so entirely inescapable that I almost felt a brief flicker of pity. But then I remembered the day they stood on my front porch, demanding my $5,000 for landscaping while telling me to rent somewhere. I remembered them trying to hack into my childhood bank accounts. I remembered them calling my life insignificant just moments ago. "I am not going to sign this right now," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and pleasant. My mother gasped, her face flushing with immediate rage. "Madeline, you cannot do this to your brother." "You have to!" I held up a single hand, stopping her outburst instantly. I said, "I am not signing it right now. An investment of $15,000 requires careful consideration. I need to review the lease terms and look over my own finances." My father narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious, but desperate. "How long do you need to review it? We are running out of time." I smoothed the front of my blazer, maintaining my serene, chilling smile. "Aunt Linda is hosting the big family celebration dinner this Saturday. I will bring the application packet with me. I will give you and Connor my absolute final answer in front of the entire family." My parents exchanged a nervous glance. They hated not having immediate control, but they were entirely out of options. They needed my pristine credit score and my cash, which meant they had to play by my rules. "Fine," my father clipped out, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Bring the money and the signed paperwork on Saturday. Do not embarrass us, Madeline. Do not ruin your brother's celebration." I watched them turn and walk briskly away, their shoulders rigid with tension as they pushed aggressively through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the pouring rain. I stood there in the quiet atrium for a long, satisfying moment, holding the application for my own luxury property tightly against my chest. They wanted a grand family celebration. They desperately wanted a massive public spectacle to honor the falling golden child. I was going to give them exactly that, but on my own terms. Saturday evening arrived with a crisp breeze that swept off the Chicago lakefront, but the interior of the upscale downtown steakhouse was perfectly warm and inviting. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant, my heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. My family had reserved the private dining room at the back of the establishment, an exclusive space that commanded a massive minimum spend. I knew for a definite fact that Connor had booked this reservation using his last active credit card, likely maxing out his final available balance just to maintain his grand illusion for one more night. As the hostess guided me toward the private room, I could already hear the booming laughter and loud chatter of my extended family echoing down the hallway. I stepped into the room and took my seat, near the end of the long, beautifully set table. Aunt Linda, Uncle David, and several cousins were already seated, holding crystal wine glasses and listening raptly to my older brother. Connor sat at the absolute center of the table, holding court like a conquering king. He was wearing a brand new tailored suit, and Vanessa sat beside him, dripping in what was likely rented jewelry. My parents, Richard and Patricia, flanked them on either side, beaming with an overwhelming pride that they had never once directed toward me. When I sat down, my mother offered a tight, acknowledging nod, but her focus immediately snapped back to her golden boy. I ordered a glass of sparkling water and simply watched the performance unfold. Connor raised his wine glass, tapping it with his knife to command the attention of the entire room. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate our massive transition," Connor announced, his voice booming with artificial confidence. "As you all know, we received an incredibly lucrative all-cash offer on our suburban estate. It was simply too profitable to turn down. Plus, Vanessa and I realized we were just too isolated out there. We want to be back in the vibrant heart of the city, right where the real action is." Aunt Linda clapped her hands together, her face glowing with admiration. It is just brilliant, Connor. To flip a property in this market and walk away with so much cash is pure genius. Where exactly are you moving now? Connor smiled, puffing out his chest. We are taking a premier unit in the downtown arts district. It is an exclusive, ultra-luxury townhome complex managed by a highly selective corporate firm. They have rooftop terraces, imported marble finishes, and private elevators. We are only going to lease it for a year, of course, just while Mom and Dad help us shop around for the perfect multi-million-dollar permanent estate. We do not want to rush into buying our next mansion until we find the absolute perfect fit. The extended family erupted into applause. My father leaned over and clapped Connor firmly on the shoulder, praising his brilliant financial maneuvering. My mother looked around the table, making sure everyone was adequately impressed by her son. It was a spectacular piece of fiction. They were actively celebrating a man who was currently in foreclosure, whose cars had been repossessed in the dead of night, and whose boat had been dragged away by a commercial towing crew. They were cheering for a ghost. Vanessa lifted her glass next. She thanked everyone for supporting their next chapter and described the premier corner unit as if the lease had already been approved. She talked about hosting rooftop cocktail parties, furnishing the private terrace, and hiring a designer before they moved in. Each detail trapped them deeper inside the lie. I knew the management portal still showed the application as denied. There was no executed lease, no approved guarantor, and no deposit. Yet my parents smiled as though the keys were already in Connor's pocket. Cousin David asked what had happened to the furniture from the suburban house. Connor answered too quickly. He claimed most of it had been sold with the property because the imaginary overseas buyer wanted a fully furnished estate. Vanessa immediately contradicted him by saying their belongings were in climate-controlled storage. For one brief second, they stared at each other across the table. Then Patricia laughed loudly and announced that wealthy people had complicated moving arrangements. The family accepted the explanation because they wanted the success story to remain true. I watched smaller signs of panic surface beneath Connor's performance. Every time a waiter entered carrying a leather bill folder, his shoulders tightened. He checked his phone between boasts, probably watching the remaining balance on his final credit card. When the sommelier suggested another bottle, Vanessa ordered it without looking at him. Connor's smile froze, but he did not object. Maintaining the illusion in front of the family mattered more than the debt waiting for him tomorrow. Then Aunt Linda asked whether they planned to keep the boat at a downtown marina. Connor's expression flickered before he claimed the Golden Boy had been sold at a profit because they were simplifying their lifestyle. My father immediately praised the decision as another example of strategic asset management. I remembered the towing crew dragging that boat away for unpaid fees. The lies were no longer protecting Connor from shame. They were forcing everyone at the table to participate in a fantasy that grew more fragile with every question. Each answer made their success story harder to sustain, while the silence around my end of the table grew sharper with every passing second. My father used the moment to compare us again. He told the table that Connor understood leverage timing and calculated risk, while I had wasted years being overly cautious. Patricia added that some people were born to build a legacy and others were content to remain employees. Several relatives glanced at me with uncomfortable sympathy. I did not defend myself. I asked Connor whether the management company had completed its screening. His wine glass paused halfway to his mouth. Of course, he said. They are simply finalizing administrative details. Administrative details, Vanessa repeated too brightly. I nodded and returned to my meal. The folder beneath my chair contained the same rejected application, the objective screening report, and the documents proving I owned the company they were criticizing. Their celebration had become a stage built entirely for the truth. All I had to do was let them finish performing. As the expensive appetizers were cleared away and the massive prime steaks were served, Connor's gaze finally locked onto me. The wine had clearly loosened his inhibitions, replacing his underlying panic with a cruel, arrogant bravado. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the crisp white tablecloth, and smiled down the length of the table at me. "So, Madeline Connor," called out, ensuring the entire room fell completely silent to listen. "How is life treating you over in your little duplex? Are you still renting that tiny box on the edge of town?" I set my fork down and met his gaze with absolute calm. "I am doing very well, Connor. My living situation is perfectly comfortable." He let out a loud, condescending laugh, shaking his head as he looked at Aunt Linda. "You know, Linda, I keep trying to give Madeline advice on real estate, but she just will not listen. She insists on throwing her money away on rent every single month. She has absolutely no equity, no assets, and no real responsibilities. It is honestly a little sad to watch. You have to build a legacy, Madeline. You cannot just float through life renting cheap apartments and hiding from the real world." My father pointed his steak knife in my direction, nodding in firm agreement. "Your brother is absolutely right, Madeline. You should be taking notes tonight. Connor has built a massive portfolio and secured his family's future. You live a small, insignificant life because you refuse to take any real risks. It is time you finally learned how the real world operates." I simply smiled, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. "You are absolutely right, Dad. I am definitely learning a lot about how the real world operates tonight." The dinner progressed, and the heavy burden of the impending bill seemed to cast a slight shadow over Connor's boisterous mood. As the waitstaff cleared the dessert plates and poured the final rounds of coffee, the celebratory atmosphere began to shift. The extended family engaged in quiet side conversations, leaving my end of the table relatively isolated. That was the exact moment my parents made their move. Richard and Patricia stood up from their seats next to Connor and walked down the length of the room. They pulled out the two empty chairs directly across from me, effectively cornering me at the end of the long table. My mother's hands were shaking slightly as she reached into her oversized designer handbag. She pulled out the familiar thick manila folder and set it down firmly on the tablecloth between us. My father reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a heavy silver pen, and slid it slowly across the smooth white linen. The pen stopped right next to the folder. He tapped his index finger aggressively against the cover of the lease agreement. "We have played your little game, Madeline," my father whispered, his voice a harsh, toxic hiss that was quiet enough to avoid drawing the attention of the extended family, but sharp enough to convey his absolute fury. "We let you have your time to review the paperwork. Now we need your final answer." My mother leaned in close, her eyes wide with a frantic, suffocating desperation. "Connor needs this townhome secured tonight. The leasing office needs the paperwork signed and the $15,000 security deposit wired by tomorrow morning. You are going to sign this lease right now, Madeline." I looked down at the silver pen, then back up at my parents. "And if I decline to empty my savings account for a luxury lease I do not need?" My father opened the folder and rotated the lease toward me, as though the decision had already been made. Yellow tabs marked every line where he expected my initials or signature. Patricia placed a printed wire instruction sheet beside it. The destination account belonged to Apex Skyline Holdings, although neither of them understood that they were ordering me to send money to my own company. I flipped through the pages slowly. Connor had listed an inflated salary, omitted the foreclosed property from his housing history, and described the lease as a temporary executive residence. My parents had even drafted a separate family repayment promise stating that Connor would reimburse me after his fictional escrow cleared. It was not notarized, secured, or enforceable in any practical sense. It was another piece of paper designed to make their demand look respectable. "You prepared all of this without asking me?" I said. "We knew you would make excuses if we gave you too much time," Patricia replied. This way, everything is easy. Sign, transfer the money, and your brother can collect the keys. I asked whether Connor had shown them the official rejection letter. My father's eyes narrowed. He said the letter was a computer error caused by an inflexible screening system. Patricia insisted the property manager had practically invited them to resubmit with a qualified guarantor. Neither of them mentioned the foreclosure, the repossessions, or the false income on the application. They were not asking me to help resolve an honest mistake. They were demanding that I lend my identity to a fraudulent picture of Connor's finances. Across the room, Connor continued entertaining the relatives, but he kept glancing toward us. Vanessa had stopped speaking entirely. She watched the folder with the fixed expression of someone waiting for a verdict. I realized they had arranged the seating deliberately. My parents were supposed to pressure me quietly, while Connor remained at the center of the celebration. Once I signed, he would announce that the final detail had been completed and accept another round of applause. My mother lowered her voice and tried a softer weapon. She reminded me of childhood Christmas mornings, family vacations, and the few tuition payments they had contributed before I began supporting myself. Every memory came with an invoice. She said they had raised me, fed me, and given me opportunities, so helping Connor was not generosity, but repayment. I asked whether the $100,000 and the college fund counted as his repayment. Her face hardened. "This is not about old resentments," she whispered. "This is about whether you are capable of loving anyone besides yourself." My father tapped the silver pen against the folder. He said I had benefited from the family name while refusing every responsibility attached to it. He warned that Aunt Linda and the others already considered me jealous and difficult. If I embarrassed Connor tonight, he promised to tell everyone that I had deliberately sabotaged my brother during a housing emergency. The threat almost made me laugh. They had spent years telling the family I was broke, irresponsible, and nearly evicted. Now they needed the same supposedly penniless daughter to provide pristine credit and $15,000 before breakfast. Their story had become so contradictory that it could survive only if I remained silent. I looked past them toward Connor. He caught my eye and raised his glass in a tiny mocking salute. Then he leaned toward Vanessa and whispered something that made her smile with visible relief. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. "She always caves when Dad threatens her." That sentence settled the last remaining question in my mind. This was not desperation alone. It was entitlement, reinforced by decades of success. They genuinely believed the threat of exclusion would still frighten me even after they had excluded me emotionally for most of my life. They thought the word disowned would strip me of something valuable. They did not understand that the family connection had already become a liability I was prepared to release. I understood then that the pen was not an invitation. It was the final instrument of their control, and they expected obedience. I closed the folder and placed both hands on the table. I asked my parents one final time whether they were willing to withdraw the demand, tell Connor the truth about his finances, and let the management company apply its normal rules. Patricia stared at me as though I had spoken another language. Richard's mouth tightened. "We are not negotiating with you," he said. "We are giving you the opportunity to prove that you belong in this family." The private room seemed to shrink around us. At the far end of the table, the laughter faded as relatives sensed the change in atmosphere. Connor stopped pretending not to watch. My mother pushed the wire instructions closer. My father positioned the pen directly beside my hand. They had reduced 33 years of family history to a signature, a deposit, and one final test of obedience. "Then you leave us with absolutely no other choice," my father stated, his voice dropping into a chilling, utterly merciless tone as he stared directly into my eyes. "Sign this right now and wire the deposit, or you are completely disowned. We will erase you from this family. Prove you aren't the selfish disappointment you've always been." My mother nodded vigorously, tears of sheer panic welling in her eyes. "Please, Madeline, do not do this to us. Do not destroy your brother's future just to be petty. Contribute to this family for once in your miserable life." The tension hit its absolute peak, suffocating the air around our corner of the table. I looked past my frantic parents, locking eyes with Connor, down the length of the room. He was leaning back in his chair, swirling the last remnants of red wine in his crystal glass. He caught my gaze, and a cruel, knowing smirk spread across his face. He leaned over, whispering something quietly into Vanessa's waiting ear. He was telling her that he knew his pathetic sister would eventually cave to their unrelenting pressure. I took a deep, calming, and steadying breath. I slowly reached my right hand out, my fingers hovering gently over the crisp white tablecloth, and I deliberately picked up the heavy silver pen. The cool metal of the heavy silver pen felt solid and grounding against my skin. The entire private dining room seemed to hold its collective breath, anticipating my total submission to their unyielding demands. My mother let out a small, premature sigh of relief, her tense shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as she watched my right hand hover. My father gave a single approving nod, assuming his toxic ultimatum had worked its usual magic and broken my spirit completely. Down the long, beautifully set length of the table, Connor was already leaning back in his chair, his cruel smirk widening as he prepared to bask in his twisted victory. He took a slow, confident sip of his expensive red wine, his eyes locked on my hand, waiting for the exact moment my signature would officially bind me to his financial disaster. I looked down at the lease agreement resting innocently on the white tablecloth. The crisp white pages detailed a luxurious lifestyle he had absolutely no right to claim. A lifestyle built on a foundation of lies, deceit, and my parents' drained retirement accounts. I clicked the heavy pen open. The sharp metallic sound echoed in the quiet corner of the room. I did not move to the signature line at the bottom of the page. Instead, I pressed the nib of the pen firmly against the very top of the application, right over the section where Connor had arrogantly printed his name. With a steady, deliberate motion, I drew a thick, heavy line directly through his name. The ink bled dark and undeniable against the white paper. I did not stop there. Using the same precise measured movements, I dragged the pen across the top margin and wrote a single word in massive, unmistakable capital letters. Denied. I slowly clicked the silver pen shut and set it down exactly where I had found it. I pushed the manila folder back across the white tablecloth, letting it slide until it stopped directly in front of my father. For a long, suspended moment, nobody moved or made a single sound. The sheer impossibility of my blatant defiance seemed to completely short-circuit their brains. My father looked down at the open folder, his brow furrowing in confusion as his eyes tried to make sense of the heavy black ink marring the pristine application. My mother leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching in her throat as she read the massive words scrawled across the top page. "What is this nonsense?" my father demanded, his voice thick with a dangerous brewing anger. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Madeline?" Connor, noticing the sudden tense shift in our parents' demeanor, set his wineglass down with a sharp clink that echoed loudly. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back and marched aggressively down the length of the table, his face flushing with a mix of irritation and alcohol-fueled bravado. "What is the holdup?" he demanded, snatching the folder from the table before my father could answer. He stared at the front page. His eyes traced the thick line crossing out his name, then locked onto the word, denied. The smug, victorious smirk instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, terrifying contortion of pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed both of his hands down onto the dining table with such explosive, uncontrolled force that the silverware clattered loudly and a crystal water glass toppled over, spilling ice and cold water across the pristine white linen. "You stupid, selfish little brat!" Connor roared, his voice booming so loudly that the quiet conversations at the other end of the room instantly ceased. Aunt Linda physically jumped in her seat, and Uncle David dropped his steak fork onto his plate. The entire extended family turned in their chairs to stare in absolute shock at the golden child completely losing his mind in public. "You are ruining my life!" Connor shouted, his face turning a dark mottled red as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You have absolutely no right to deny my lease. You are supposed to be helping this family. You are supposed to be supporting my transition. I am moving into a premier luxury townhome. I am just renting until I buy my next multi-million-dollar mansion." He grabbed the manila folder and shook it violently in my direction, the pages fluttering wildly. "You think you are so incredibly smart," he sneered, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "You think you are better than me. You are a nobody, Madeline. You are an insignificant nobody who rents a cheap little shack on the dusty edge of town. You do not own anything. You do not build anything. You are just a jealous, pathetic, bitter loser who cannot handle seeing her older brother succeed. Now pick up that silver pen, sign the paper, and wire the deposit before I make sure Dad disowns you for good." My mother was weeping loudly now, clutching her white linen napkin to her chest as she begged me to just do what he said. My father was radiating a cold, calculated, and terrifying fury, his jaw set firmly as he prepared to deliver on his threat to erase me from the family tree forever. The entire room was completely paralyzed by the unfolding spectacle, watching the golden boy throw a massive, unhinged tantrum over a rental application. Through it all, I remained perfectly, remarkably still. I did not flinch when he slammed his hands on the table. I did not look away when he screamed in my face. I simply sat there in my seat, letting his toxic outburst wash over me, absorbing the absolute desperation hiding just beneath his arrogant words. He was panicking. His house of cards was falling, and he was terrified. When his furious shouting finally subsided into heavy, ragged breathing, the absolute silence in the private dining room was deafening. I looked at my furious brother, my weeping mother, and my enraged father. I took a deep, calming breath and slowly, deliberately stood up from my chair. I smoothed the front of my blazer, maintaining the serene, chilling smile that had unnerved my parents earlier in my office lobby. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Connor," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "I do not rent a cheap little shack." I reached down and picked up my designer leather briefcase from the carpeted floor next to my chair. I set it gently on the table, the brass hardware clicking softly against the polished wood. I unclasped the lock and opened the top flap, reaching inside. I bypassed my logistics reports and my supply chain spreadsheets, sliding my fingers around the thick, heavy legal folder I had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I pulled the folder out and closed my briefcase, setting it aside. I held the folder in both hands, feeling the substantial weight of my actual legacy. I looked directly into Connor's bloodshot, furious eyes. "And you are also right that I did not sign that specific lease agreement," I continued, my tone conversational and completely unbothered by his previous threats. "But that is only because, as the sole owner of the property management firm, I do not sign the tenant application side of the paperwork." I dropped the thick legal folder directly onto the absolute center of the table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right next to the ruined lease agreement. The heavy cover fell open, revealing a thick stack of pristine, watermarked documents. Sitting right on top, undeniably clear and legally binding, were the verified incorporation documents and the master deed of ownership for Apex Skyline Holdings. The papers clearly listed my full legal name as the sole member and authorized manager of the exact luxury townhome complex he was desperately trying to rent. I stood tall and proud, looking down at the three people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. I own the entire luxury building, Connor. I stated the absolute truth, ringing through the totally silent room like a heavy bell. And your rental application is now officially and permanently denied. The absolute silence that followed my declaration was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. My father, whose hand had been hovering over the ruined lease agreement, slowly pulled his arm back, as if the legal documents resting on the tablecloth had suddenly caught fire. His eyes darted from the heavy black ink of my name on the master deed to my face, his mind violently struggling to process the impossible truth sitting right in front of him. My mother stopped weeping. Down the length of the private dining room, the extended family remained completely frozen. Nobody dared to breathe. They were all waiting for the punchline, for the moment where Connor would laugh and reveal this was all some elaborate, twisted joke. But Connor was not laughing. He was staring at the incorporation documents with a hollow, terrified expression, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. I kept my gaze locked directly on my father. "You told me to rent somewhere, Dad. You told me I had no real responsibilities and no assets, so I did exactly what you said." My voice was calm, completely devoid of the anger or bitterness they always accused me of harboring. "I rented somewhere. I rented my cheap box. I lived below my means. I saved every single penny I earned from my corporate salary. I skipped the luxury vacations, the expensive cars, and the designer furniture that you all valued so highly. I worked quietly, and then I bought. I did not buy a massive mansion to impress the neighbors. I bought a second duplex, and then a fourplex, and then an apartment building. I kept building my portfolio while you were busy funding Connor's illusions. I now own 12 commercial and residential properties across the city. And that includes the premier luxury townhome complex you are currently trying to move into." Aunt Linda let out a sharp, audible gasp that echoed clearly across the quiet dining room. Uncle David set his steak knife down with a heavy clatter, his eyes widening as he looked from me to my father, finally grasping the magnitude of what was happening. I did not break eye contact with my parents as I reached back into my designer briefcase. I pulled out a separate, thinner folder and laid it gently on the table next to the incorporation documents. Inside was the property deed for Unit A, along with a detailed, verified printout of Connor's credit report that my automated software had pulled during his failed application process. I placed my hand flat on the folder. "I am the landlord of the property you are desperately trying to lease, Connor." I turned my head slowly, directing my attention to my older brother, who was now gripping the edges of the table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. "And as the absolute owner of Apex Skyline Holdings, I am formally rejecting your application. I am rejecting you based purely on the standard objective criteria required by my management company. You do not meet the income requirements. You do not have the liquid cash reserves. But more importantly, you have a financial history that makes you a massive liability to any property owner in this city." I opened the thinner folder, sliding the credit report printout across the white linen tablecloth so it rested perfectly between my parents and Connor. The bright red warning flags printed by the automated background check system were impossible to ignore. "I am rejecting your application due to your horrific credit score," I stated, my voice echoing clearly so every single aunt, uncle, and cousin could hear the absolute truth. "The system automatically flagged your 2 recent vehicle repossessions. You do not have hundreds of thousands of dollars in escrow waiting to be cleared. You have completely maxed out credit cards and a trail of unpaid debts that stretch back for years. You are entirely bankrupt, Connor." Vanessa, who had been sitting frozen beside her husband, suddenly covered her face with her hands, letting out a small, humiliated sob. Connor looked like he was going to be physically sick. He was stripped bare, exposed as a fraud in front of the very audience he had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to impress. His carefully constructed facade of wealth and undeniable success was completely and utterly destroyed. He opened his mouth, his face flushing a deep mottled purple, but no words came out. He could only sputter a pathetic, wordless sound of total defeat. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the edge of the dining table. "But the most important reason your application is denied, Connor, is the active, ongoing foreclosure currently staining your record." I looked down the long table, meeting the shocked faces of my extended family members, one by one, before looking back at my brother. "You did not sell your house for a massive, highly profitable cash offer. The corporate executive who made the cash offer never existed. You are leaving that sprawling estate because you have not paid the mortgage in nearly a year. The foreclosure is active. The lender controls the process, and the house is being taken from you, Connor." The reaction from the extended family was immediate and visceral. Several cousins began whispering frantically to each other. Aunt Linda pressed her napkin to her mouth, her eyes darting back and forth between Connor and my parents in absolute horror. Uncle David shook his head slowly, the admiration he had shown Connor just an hour ago transforming instantly into profound disgust. The brilliant real estate flip they had all been applauding, the massive legacy they had been celebrating, was nothing more than a desperate, pathetic lie designed to cover up a spectacular financial collapse. They had been toasting to a bank foreclosure. I turned my attention back to my parents. Richard and Patricia had turned ghostly pale. The healthy, vibrant color had completely drained from their faces, leaving them looking aged and incredibly frail. The illusion of their wealthy, perfect son, the golden child they had sacrificed their own retirement and my emotional well-being to protect, had completely disintegrated right in front of their carefully curated social circle. They could no longer pretend. They could no longer spin the narrative. The verified documents were sitting right there on the table, undeniable proof of my success and Connor's absolute ruin. My mother stared at the credit report, her hands trembling violently in her lap. My father looked like the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. "You demanded that I empty my savings to pay a $15,000 security deposit to my own company." I continued, my tone gentle but absolutely relentless. "You threatened to disown me and erase me from this family if I did not sign a lease to rent my own property back to a man who was actively in foreclosure. You stood in the lobby of my corporate office and called my life small and insignificant. You told me I was a selfish disappointment who needed to learn how the real world operates." I gestured to the thick stack of incorporation documents, the master deed, and the bright red rejection notice. "This is how the real world operates, Dad. Actions have actual consequences. Debts have to be paid, and eventually, the lies run out of room." Connor was still sputtering, his chest heaving, as he struggled to draw a full breath. The heavy silver pen my father had so aggressively slid across the table was still resting next to the ruined lease agreement, a silent monument to their failed ambush. I had not yelled. I had not thrown a tantrum. I had not slammed my hands on the table or caused a hysterical scene. I had simply presented the cold, hard, verifiable facts. I had used their own desperate trap to permanently dismantle their toxic dynamic. I stood there, feeling the heavy, suffocating burden of the scapegoat label finally lifting off my shoulders. I was no longer the family disappointment. The days of being bullied by the people who were supposed to love me were completely over. I was the sole owner of Apex Skyline Holdings, and I had just evicted them from my life. The private dining room remained paralyzed for what felt like an eternity. The heavy mahogany doors shielding our corner from the busy restaurant outside, but offering absolutely no protection from the devastating truth I had just unleashed. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of jazz music bleeding through the walls were the only sounds left. Connor stared blankly at the dark wood of the table, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He looked incredibly small, stripped of his expensive suits and rented confidence, reduced to nothing more than a desperate man with maxed-out credit cards and a trail of foreclosures. Vanessa was openly crying now, her face buried in her hands, her rented jewelry catching the dim light as her shoulders shook. Down the length of the table, the extended family began to stir. The quiet whispers started first, exchanging horrified glances and shaking their heads. Uncle David leaned over to Aunt Linda, his voice a low, disappointed murmur that carried perfectly in the tense silence. He was calculating the massive lie they had all been sold, the fake luxury celebration funded by an illusion. They were already distancing themselves, pulling back from the golden boy who had just been exposed as an absolute fraud in front of their entire social circle. My father looked completely broken. The commanding, terrifying presence he had projected just 10 minutes ago had vanished, leaving an aged, defeated man sitting rigidly in his expensive chair. His toxic ultimatum had backfired spectacularly, and the realization that he held absolutely no power over me, no financial leverage, and no emotional control was visibly destroying him. He stared at the incorporation documents resting on the white tablecloth, as if they were written in a foreign language. But it was my mother who reacted first. The profound, ghostly paleness of her face suddenly flushed with a frantic, desperate color. The icy rage she had directed at me all evening completely disappeared, replaced instantly by a weapon she had honed over decades of manipulating our family dynamic. Patricia burst into tears. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, dramatic, and entirely calculated display of sheer desperation. She let out a wrenching sob, pressing her hands to her mouth as she looked from Connor's defeated face to my calm one. The absolute whiplash of her emotional shift was staggering to witness. Just moments ago, she had eagerly watched my father slide a pen across the table, fully supporting his threat to disown me and erase me from the family tree if I did not empty my savings to save her perfect son. She had called my life miserable. She had begged me not to be a selfish disappointment. Now realizing that I was the actual millionaire in the room, realizing that I held the absolute key to her son's survival, she completely changed her tune. "Madeline, please," my mother wept, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. She stood up from her chair and rushed around the edge of the table, stopping just short of reaching out to grab my arm. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot do this to your brother." I did not move an inch. I simply watched her perform, feeling completely detached from the frantic energy she was trying to force upon me. "I am not doing anything to him, Mom. I am enforcing standard leasing policies for my property management firm. He does not qualify." "But you own the building," she pleaded, the tears freely flowing down her cheeks, ruining her carefully applied makeup. "You are the sole owner, Madeline. You can make an exception. You can bypass the credit check and the deposit. You can let him move in. He has nowhere else to go. The bank is taking the house. They have absolutely nothing left." She looked back at Connor, who was now staring at me with a pathetic, wide-eyed desperation. The arrogant smirk he had worn while telling me I rented a cheap shack was completely gone. He was silently begging his mother to fix the disaster he had created, relying on the same toxic dynamic that had shielded him from consequences his entire life. "He is your flesh and blood," my mother sobbed, clasping her hands together in front of her chest, as if she were praying to me. Please, Madeline, let him live in the townhome. Just let him stay there for free until he gets back on his feet. You own 12 properties. You have so much wealth. You will not even notice the missing rent money. I stared at her, letting the absolute audacity of her request settle over the quiet dining room. The extended family was watching in stunned silence as Patricia begged her scapegoat daughter to provide free, luxury housing for her golden son. "Family takes care of family," my mother wept, stepping closer and finally placing a trembling hand on the sleeve of my blazer. "We have to look out for each other when things get hard. That is what families do, Madeline. We support each other unconditionally." I looked down at her hand resting on my arm. I thought about the sheer, suffocating hypocrisy of her words. I looked at the people sitting around me. These were the people who had abandoned me emotionally when I was just a child trying to earn a fraction of their affection. These were the people who had belittled my career, mocked my lifestyle, and treated my independence as a personal insult. These were the people who had tried to access my accounts and wire $12,000 to Connor's marina after I refused to fund his lifestyle. They had walked into my corporate office lobby and humiliated me. They had cornered me at this very table and threatened to erase my existence if I did not submit to their financial demands. They had never once taken care of me. They had never once supported me unconditionally. I had built my entire empire in the shadows because I knew that the second they discovered my wealth, they would try to drain it dry to fund Connor's endless failures. And here they were, proving me absolutely right. I gently but firmly brushed my mother's hand off my arm. I smoothed my blazer and looked directly into her frantic, tear-filled eyes. Family doesn't hand one child $100,000 and tell the other she's a worthless disappointment, I said coldly. The words echoed in the dead silent room, cutting through my mother's dramatic sobbing like a sharp blade. She physically recoiled, stepping back, as if I had struck her. My father closed his eyes, finally looking away from the table. They knew exactly what I was talking about. They knew about the massive secret down payment they had handed Connor years ago, while telling me I had to work 3 jobs to pay for my own modest life. They knew about the endless bailouts, the paid-off credit cards, and the constant, unwavering safety net they had provided for him, while leaving me to fall. "You chose your legacy," I continued, my voice steady, calm, and entirely devoid of the emotional manipulation they thrived on. "You poured every single ounce of your love, your money, and your respect into Connor. You built him up to be a king, and you expected me to be his loyal subject? But kings have to pay their own debts eventually." I turned my gaze away from my weeping mother and looked down the table at my older brother. He flinched under my stare. The boy who had been handed the world on a silver platter was finally facing the absolute reality of his own incompetence. There was no secret cash reserve left to save him. There was no multi-million-dollar mansion waiting in the wings. There was only the cold, hard consequence of his actions. "Rent somewhere, Connor," I said, delivering the final, devastating blow with perfect, polite clarity. "I hear the motels by the highway don't check credit." I picked up my heavy leather briefcase, turned my back on them, and walked out the door, unapologetic and entirely free, refusing to rescue the people who tried to destroy me. The crisp Chicago night air hit my face the absolute second I stepped out of the heavy mahogany doors of the steakhouse. I did not look back. I did not pause to see if anyone had followed me out into the street. I simply handed my ticket to the valet, tipped him generously, and waited for my car in total, uninterrupted silence. When I finally slid into the driver's seat and pulled away from the curb, a profound sense of physical lightness washed over my entire body. For 33 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my family and their endless expectations, their constant criticisms, and their bottomless demands. I had spent my entire life trying to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of seeing it. But as I merged onto the highway and watched the city skyline reflect in my rearview mirror, I knew with absolute certainty that I was finally done. I had drawn my line in the sand, and I was never going back across it. The days that followed my dramatic exit from the private dining room were remarkably peaceful. I had expected a massive barrage of angry phone calls, guilt-tripping text messages, and unannounced visits to my corporate office. I had fully prepared my security team for the possibility of my father showing up to make a scene. But the reality was far more pathetic. They called, of course, but their messages lacked the commanding venom they had always used to control me. Instead, they left frantic, tearful voicemails begging for a second chance, pleading for family unity and asking if we could just sit down and talk about Connor and his housing crisis like rational adults. I listened to exactly 2 of those messages before I permanently blocked all of their phone numbers, filtered their email addresses directly into my trash folder, and instructed the lobby security at my office building to permanently deny them entry. I was not going to negotiate my boundaries. I never spoke to my parents or my brother again. Not a single word. I did not send holiday cards, I did not attend extended family gatherings, and I completely ignored the dramatic letters my mother occasionally mailed to my office address. Through the natural grapevine of the city and a few remaining connections with extended relatives who had witnessed the spectacular implosion at the restaurant, I eventually learned the full extent of the long-term consequences they faced. The aftermath was exactly as devastating as I had predicted. The bank officially foreclosed on Connor's sprawling suburban estate just 3 weeks after our dinner. Because I had firmly denied his application for the luxury townhome, and because his credit score was genuinely horrific, no reputable leasing company in the city would approve him for a lease. He had burned through every single favor, exhausted every available line of credit, and completely destroyed his professional reputation. With absolutely nowhere else to go, the golden child of the family was forced to pack up his remaining possessions, gather his weeping wife, and move directly into Richard and Patricia's unfurnished basement. It was a spectacular fall from grace, and the reality of their new living arrangement shattered their perfect social illusion entirely. My parents had spent their entire adult lives judging others for their financial missteps and boasting to their country club friends about their brilliant, wealthy son. Now they were forced to hide the truth. They stopped hosting dinner parties. They dropped out of their expensive social clubs because they could no longer afford the exorbitant monthly dues. Supporting Connor Vanessa and their massive, unchecked spending habits drained Richard and Patricia's retirement accounts at a terrifying speed. They had handed him $100,000 years ago, assuming it was an investment in a guaranteed legacy. Instead, it was the first down payment on their own ruin. They had to pay for his storage units, his daily living expenses, and his mounting legal fees as the bank aggressively pursued him for the remaining debt on his foreclosed mortgage. Within 2 years, my parents were financially devastated. Their comfortable, wealthy retirement transformed into a miserable, anxiety-filled existence where they constantly worried about paying the utility bills and keeping food on the table for their grown son, who refused to get a regular job. They were trapped in the toxic dynamic they had so carefully created, forced to sleep under the same roof as the monster of entitlement they had built from scratch, while their world steadily collapsed into a self-inflicted nightmare. My life expanded in ways I had only ever dreamed about. Free from the constant draining emotional vampire that was my family, I poured all of my renewed energy and focus directly into Apex Skyline Holdings. The business exploded. What started as 12 properties quickly scaled up to 15, then 18, and finally, a robust portfolio of 20 highly profitable residential and commercial buildings spread across the most desirable neighborhoods in the entire city. My automated software systems became more efficient, my management team grew, and my personal wealth skyrocketed, far beyond anything my father or my brother could have ever imagined or achieved. But the most significant change was not the money in my bank account. It was the absolute freedom that came with it. I stopped working 80-hour weeks and finally started living. I bought a first-class ticket to Europe and spent an entire month wandering through cobblestone streets in Italy, drinking amazing wine and admiring ancient architecture. I hiked through the lush green mountains of New Zealand and spent 2 weeks relaxing on pristine, sun-drenched beaches in the Maldives. I traveled the world entirely on my own terms, answering to absolutely nobody, and enjoying the magnificent fruits of my silent, relentless labor. Every single city I visited was a beautiful reminder that I had successfully broken the chains of my past. When I returned home to Chicago, I focused heavily on building a real support system. I realized that true family is not determined by shared genetics or a shared last name, but by the people who actively choose to show up for you, respect your boundaries, and cheer for your victories. I surrounded myself with a vibrant, chosen family of brilliant, ambitious, and deeply supportive friends who inspired me to be my absolute best self. We hosted incredible dinner parties in my newly purchased penthouse, celebrated each other's career milestones without an ounce of jealousy, and created a warm, loving environment that my childhood home had entirely lacked. It was during one of these amazing dinner parties that I met Michael. He was a corporate architect with a gentle laugh and an incredibly sharp mind. From our very first conversation, he treated me with profound respect and genuine curiosity. He did not feel threatened by my massive success or my wealth. Instead, he celebrated it. He listened intently when I talked about real estate acquisitions, asked brilliant questions about my long-term business strategies, and supported my vision unconditionally. He valued my independence just as much as he valued our growing partnership. For the very first time in my life, I felt truly seen, completely understood, and deeply loved for exactly who I was, without having to diminish my own light to make someone else feel comfortable. I hope my story serves as a reminder for you. Looking back on that fateful night in the private dining room, I realized that walking out was the greatest gift I ever gave myself. To anyone watching this who might be struggling with a toxic family dynamic, please listen carefully. You do not have to accept abuse just because it comes from people who share your blood. You do not owe your life, your hard-earned savings, or your mental health to individuals who only value you for what they can extract from you. The absolute sweetest revenge you can ever achieve does not require shouting, arguing, or stooping to their level. The ultimate victory is simply establishing ironclad boundaries, stepping away, letting those toxic people entirely destroy themselves with their own terrible choices, and choosing to boldly thrive in absolute magnificent silence. Call to action. Have you ever had someone underestimate what you valued most, only to prove them wrong in the end? Share your story in the comments below. If this tale of standing your ground against family betrayal resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of triumph over life's toughest challenges. Thank you for joining me on this journey.